In this lecture, we're going to utilize metafields to improve the redirect behavior we implemented in the previous lecture. Currently, I'm looking at the signout method in the header component. We programmed the app to redirect the user if they attempt to visit a restricted page while they're not logged in. In the conditional statement, we're checking what the current route is before redirecting them. This solution works if we're working on a small-sized app, but it doesn't scale for large apps. You may have dozens of routes where the user must be authenticated to navigate to it. If that's the case, we'll have to update the conditional statement with the routes. Here is what it would look like. I've updated the conditional statement to check for 5 different routes. These routes don't exist. You don't have to make the same changes. This is just an example. As you can see, it's starting to look unpleasant. Just imagine what this would look like if we had 20 routes or even 200. This solution works, but it's not elegant. I'll undo this quickly. We can improve upon this by using route metafields. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the route metafields documentation page. Metafields are custom values that can be assigned to your routes. They can hold any type of data, a string, object, number, etc. By giving our route a metafield, we can check for the metafield rather than the name. Using metafields is quite simple. Let's get started. The first step is to add the metafield to the record. Open the router file in your editor. We'll add a metafield to the Manage Route record. In the record, add a property called meta. The value for this must be an object. The object can contain a set of key value pairs. We can store any type of data in this object. We're going to create one property called requires auth. We'll set it to true. We'll use this to determine whether a route requires authentication. We won't be adding it to the rest of the routes because it's not necessary. We'll assume that if the meta field doesn't exist, then the route doesn't require authentication. The next step is to check for the meta field. We'll switch to the header component file. Search for the signout method. This method is where we redirected the user. Inside the conditional statement, rather than checking for the name, we'll check the meta.requiresAuth property. We want to check if it's true. The meta object is available on every record. It'll hold the meta fields we added to the record. If the requiresAuth property exists and is true, then we'll redirect the user. We can take this even further by checking the meta field on every request. Open the Manage component in the editor. We used the before route enter guard to check if the user was authenticated. It works, but it only works for this component. If we had another component that requires authentication, we would have to copy and paste this solution. It's not exactly ideal at the moment. With the introduction of metafields, we can check for the metafield on a global level rather than in the component itself. Let's adjust this code using metafields. First, we'll need to remove the guard from the component. It doesn't make sense to keep it around if we're moving things on a global level. I'm going to comment out the guard as well as the import statement for the store. I'm commenting out the code rather than removing it for reference and example purposes. Usually, you wouldn't keep it around. You can safely remove this if you want. Alright, next we'll need to update the global guard. We defined the global guard in the router file. Currently, we're logging a message. Let's update the log statement to log a property called to.meta. The to object represents the route the user is navigating to. We're accessing a property called meta. The meta property is an object of metadata attached to a record. If metadata does not exist on the route record, the value will be an empty object. To better understand, let's check out what's inside. Refresh the page in the browser. In the console, we'll find the metadata from our route. We want to check if any of the matched records have the requires auth meta field. If any of them do, we will want to check if the user is authenticated. Let's get started. Back in the editor, we're going to comment out the log statement in the global guard function. The first step we'll take is to check for the meta field. There isn't a point in checking if the user is authenticated if the route is accessible to anyone. We're writing the logic in a global guard. It's important that we don't assume anything. We'll create a conditional block. We will want to check if the requires auth meta field is present in the records that match the path the user is navigating to. Inside the condition, we're going to check the to.meta.requiresAuth property with the not operator. If the record does not have this meta field, it doesn't require authentication. We'll let the user proceed by calling the next function. The next function doesn't end the function. We'll want to return the function before moving on to the next step. If the condition ends up not passing, we know that the route does require authentication. This means we should check the store for the user's authentication status. First, we need the store. At the top of the router file, import the user store. Go back to the navigation guard. After the conditional block, create a variable called store. The value for this variable will be the store function. The store is now accessible from within the guard. Add a second conditional statement. The condition will check if the store.userLoggedIn property is true. If they are logged in, we'll let them proceed by calling the next function inside the conditional block. If they aren't logged in, we'll need to redirect them to the home page. Let's create an else block. Inside the else block, we'll call the next function. We'll pass in an object with the name property set to home. We're using the same logic we used in the manage component for redirecting the user. The main difference is that this will run on any record that has the requires auth meta field. Let's check if this solution works. Refresh the home page. The page will load normally. Next, let's try logging in and navigate to the Manage page. The Manage page is working fine. We can view the route history to make sure nothing funny is going on. It's always a good idea to keep an eye on this. If any of the records have the requires auth property, we will proceed to check if the user is authenticated. If they aren't, we will redirect them to the home page. Otherwise, we'll let them proceed onto their destination. This behavior is possible thanks to route meta fields. By assigning custom values, we can write more flexible code for our application.